Right, let's talk about war. The Great War. It wasn't swift, and it certainly wasn't glorious. It was a brutal, grinding 4-year slog that swallowed an entire generation of young men. They called it the war to end all wars. This was a global catastrophe. From the sprawling fields of France to the dusty plains of the Middle East, millions of men were thrown into the meat grinder. It was the first truly modern war. The sheer numbers are just staggering. Around 20 million people were dead by the end of it. Great empires crumbled into dust. A new, more dangerous one was born from its ashes. This wasn't the end of war. To understand how this whole mess kicked off, rewind to the early 1900s. On the surface, Europe was experiencing incredible progress with new technologies and flourishing empires. But underneath, rivalries and old grudges were growing. Nations were competing for power, building up armies and consumed by nationalism. Europe was a continent brimming with ambition and paranoia. They were standing on a precipice, and it would only take a tiny push to send them all tumbling over the edge. The fuse for the global explosion that was World War I can be found in one particular region, the Balkans, accurately known as the Powder Keg of Europe. This corner of southeastern Europe was where the interests of 3 massive, crumbling empires collided: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Groups like the Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians had been dominated by foreign powers for centuries, and they were sick of it. Serbia, especially, had big dreams of a unified South Slavic nation. This put it on a direct collision course with the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The great powers had created a system of alliances. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other, the Triple Entente: France, Russia, and Great Britain. What this system actually did was create a gigantic, continent-wide tripwire. All it would take was one spark in that powder keg to set the whole thing off. And in the summer of 1914, a young Serbian nationalist was about to light the fuse. Europe was a tinderbox. Everyone had a chip on their shoulder. The alliance system was supposed to stop wars. The idea was simple. If you attack one of us, you fight all of us. The 2 big gangs were the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. Germany, with a massive industrial engine. They were mates with the sprawling Austro-Hungarian Empire. On the other side was the Triple Entente, France still seething about a thrashing from Germany. Then there was the colossal Russian Empire. And finally, Great Britain. This whole setup was a catastrophe waiting to happen. And the machine was just waiting for a switch to be flicked. Making promises is one thing, but you've got to have the gear to back it up. And boy, did they have the gear. The decades before 1914 saw the most frantic, expensive, and downright terrifying arms race the world had ever seen. Every major European power was pouring unbelievable amounts of money into its military, driven by fear and national pride. It was a vicious cycle of paranoia. Germany was at the heart of this. The Kaiser wanted a navy that could challenge Britain's Royal Navy, kicking off a massive naval race. The British invented the dreadnought. The Germans immediately started building their own. On land, things were just as mad. Armies were getting bigger and bigger. New technologies were making weapons deadlier than ever before. It made war seem normal, creating a culture where military solutions were the answer. Newspapers were full of patriotic stories. An entire generation grew up believing that war was a glorious adventure. They were being sold a lie. So, you have the tangled alliances and massive armies. All you need is a spark. That spark came on a sunny summer's day in Sarajevo. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was visiting with his wife, Sophie. Serbian nationalists, supplied with weapons by the Black Hand, planned to assassinate him. The first attempt failed. Fate took a hand when the Archduke's driver made a wrong turn. Gavrilo Princip seized the opportunity. He stepped forward and fired 2 shots, killing both Sophie and Franz Ferdinand. Those 2 small bullets set the world on a path to utter devastation. The powder keg had been lit. The assassination of the Archduke didn't immediately cause a war. For a few weeks it seemed like the crisis might be contained. It was a shocking event for sure, but there had been assassinations before. This time, however, things were different. In Vienna, The hardliners in the Austro-Hungarian government saw this as the perfect excuse to do what they had wanted to do for years: crush Serbia once and for all. They were convinced the Serbian government was behind the plot, and they wanted blood. But they were a bit nervous about Russia, Serbia's big Slavic brother, who they knew would probably step in to protect them. So they needed to check with their main ally. This is where Germany made one of the most disastrous decisions in history. On July 5th, Austria-Hungary asked Germany for its support. The Kaiser and his government gave them what's known as the blank check. They basically said, do whatever you need to do to Serbia, and we'll back you up no matter what. They thought Russia would back down. They thought Britain would stay out of it. They gambled that a quick, sharp war against Serbia would be over before anyone else could react. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. With Germany's promise of unconditional support, Austria-Hungary felt emboldened to act. So on July 23rd, almost a month after the assassination, Austria-Hungary sent an ultimatum to Serbia. It was a list of 10 demands, designed to be impossible for any self-respecting nation to accept. It demanded that Austrian officials be allowed into Serbia to conduct their own investigation and suppress any anti-Austrian groups. Serbia, surprisingly, agreed to almost all of the demands, but they refused to accept the one that would have completely violated their sovereignty. That was all the excuse Vienna needed. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary rejected Serbia's reply and declared war. The first domino had just been pushed over. Now the whole ridiculous clockwork system of alliances kicked into gear. Russia, seeing its small ally Serbia under attack, began to mobilize its massive army. This set off alarm bells in Berlin. The German generals had a plan, the Schlieffen plan, which was based on speed. It called for knocking out France quickly before the slow-moving Russian army could fully mobilize. So, when Russia started mobilizing, Germany felt it had no choice. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. Then, because France was Russia's ally, Germany declared war on France 2 days later. The dominoes were now falling thick and fast, and the lights were going out all over Europe. Right, so the politicians have made a complete mess of things. The dominoes are tumbling and war has been declared. All over Europe, millions of young men are suddenly being told to drop their tools, leave their families and put on a uniform. And the amazing thing is, they went. They didn't just go, they went enthusiastically. You see pictures from August 1914, and the streets of London, Paris and Berlin are packed with cheering crowds. The trains carrying soldiers to the front are covered in flowers and patriotic slogans. Everyone thought it was going to be a brilliant adventure, a chance to see the world and be a hero. The common wisdom, the line peddled by the generals and the newspapers, was that it would all be over by Christmas. They imagined a war of movement, of dashing cavalry charges and decisive battles, a quick, sharp, glorious scrap, and then home in time for turkey and pudding. The French soldiers marched off in their bright red trousers and blue coats, looking magnificent but making for a ridiculously easy target. The Germans in their grey uniforms were convinced their perfectly timed plan would deliver a swift victory. Nobody, absolutely nobody, had any idea of the industrial-scale slaughter that was about to be unleashed upon them. The first moves were exactly what everyone expected. Huge armies, the biggest the world had ever seen, began to move across the continent. On the Eastern Front, the massive Russian army, the famous steamroller, began to lumber into Germany, faster than the Germans had anticipated. But the main event, the place where everyone thought the war would be won or lost, was the Western Front. This is where the bulk of the German army was heading. Their plan was simple, brutal, and breathtakingly ambitious. They were going to smash through neutral Belgium, sweep down into France, and capture Paris before the French even knew what hit them. And so the guns of August began to roar. The initial clashes were chaotic and bloody. The old ways of war met the new deadly technology head-on. Cavalrymen on horseback charged straight into machine gun fire and were mown down in seconds. Infantrymen advancing in neat lines were torn apart by artillery shells that could now be fired from miles away. It was a brutal education. The romantic notions of war, of honor and glory evaporated in the first few days of combat. The adventure was over before it had even really begun. And Christmas? Christmas was a lifetime away. The Germans had a plan, the Schlieffen plan, named after the old general. It was a giant sweeping maneuver designed to win a two-front war. The idea was a massive right hook through Belgium and northern France to encircle Paris. Then they would shift troops east to deal with the Russians. Speed was everything, but the Belgians put up a surprisingly stubborn fight, holding up the German advance. As the Germans pushed on, they left a trail of destruction and committed terrible atrocities. The British sent over their army, the BEF, clashing with the Germans at the Battle of Marne. The German armies were getting closer to Paris, but the plan was starting to fray at the edges. By early September 1914, things looked grim. The German army was on the outskirts of Paris. You could hear the sound of their artillery in the city. The French and British forces were exhausted, battered, and had been retreating for 2 weeks solid. It seemed like the Schlieffen plan had worked. One more push, and Paris would fall. The war on the Western Front would be over. But then, something extraordinary happened. The French commander, a quiet, unflappable general named Joseph Joffre, decided that the time for retreating was over. He was going to turn, and he was going to fight. The German advance had created a fatal flaw in their own lines. As the German First Army, on the far right of the Hook, swung down to the east of Paris instead of the west, they exposed their flank to the French forces defending the capital. Joffre spotted the opportunity. It was a massive gamble. If it failed, the French army would be completely destroyed. He issued a simple, stark order to his men. The hour has come to advance at all costs, and to die where you stand, rather than give way. On the 6th of September, the battered Allied armies stopped retreating, turned around, and launched a desperate, full-scale counterattack along the Marne River. The battle that followed was immense, a sprawling, chaotic fight that stretched for over 100 miles. The fighting was ferocious. In one of the most famous episodes of the war, the military governor of Paris commandeered every taxi in the city. Around 600 of them were used to rush thousands of reserve soldiers to the front line. It wasn't a huge number in the grand scheme of things, but it was a massive boost to morale, a symbol of France's absolute determination not to surrender. The taxis of the Marne became a legend, a sign that the entire nation was in this fight. The German soldiers, pushed to the absolute limits of their endurance, were stunned. They had thought the enemy was broken, and now they were facing a furious counterattack. Their supplies were low, they were exhausted, and their lines were dangerously overstretched. After several days of brutal fighting, the German commanders realized the gamble had failed. The Schlieffen plan was dead. Fearing their armies would be encircled and destroyed, they gave the order to retreat. The German army fell back for 40 miles until they reached high ground behind the river Aisne. The Battle of the Marne was over. Paris was saved, and the war of movement was finished. The retreat was a bitter pill. They fell back to a strong defensive position and started to dig deep trenches. The Allies ran headlong into this new defensive line and found they couldn't break through. So, the Allies had to dig in too. What followed was the race to the sea, attempts by each side to outflank the other. By November 1914, an unbroken line of trenches stretched across northern France. What had started as a war of movement had now ground to a halt. As winter set in, the soldiers found themselves living in cold, wet, muddy ditches. The Western Front had been born. For the next 4 years, it would become one of the most horrific killing grounds in history. So what was it actually like living in these trenches? Well, to put it simply, it was hell on earth. The first thing that would hit you is the smell. A ghastly cocktail of rotting bodies, stagnant water, overflowing latrines, cordite from the shells, and unwashed men. The trenches were rarely straight, but were built in a zigzag pattern to stop an enemy blast from traveling too far down the line. They were often just ditches, dug in a hurry, with a firing step at the front and maybe some wooden planks called duckboards at the bottom to try and keep you out of the mud. But when it rained, the whole system just turned into a stinking liquid bog. The mud was a constant enemy. It was everywhere. It clogged up rifles, it sucked boots off feet, and it could swallow a man whole. Soldiers suffered from trench foot, a nasty fungal infection caused by having constantly wet and cold feet. It could lead to gangrene and amputation. Then there were the pests. Rats, some as big as cats, swarmed everywhere, feasting on rations and on the dead. Lice were another torment, living in the seams of soldiers' uniforms and causing a constant maddening itch, as well as a disease called trench fever. It was a life of profound, unrelenting misery. A soldier's day was a routine of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The mornings and evenings would start with stand to, where everyone would man the fire step in case of an attack. The rest of the day might be spent trying to repair the trench, filling sandbags or carrying supplies, all while trying to avoid the attention of enemy snipers. Night was the busiest and most dangerous time. This was when patrols would crawl out into no man's land, the shattered, corpse-strewn wasteland between the two trench lines, to gather intelligence or repair the barbed wire. It was nerve-shredding work. And then there was the shelling, the constant random threat of death from above. Artillery bombardments could last for hours or even days, turning the landscape into a lunar surface and shattering the nerves of the men huddled in their dugouts. The psychological toll was immense. Many men suffered from shell shock, a condition we would now call PTSD. They were haunted by the constant noise, the fear, and the sight of their friends being blown to pieces. This wasn't the glorious adventure they had signed up for. This was a grim industrial process of survival, in a world made of mud, steel, and death. The war was stuck in a muddy stalemate. Generals needed a new idea to break the deadlock. They found it in the laboratory. It became a chemists' war, a horrifying war where the very air could kill you. The Germans first used chlorine gas in 1915. A greenish-yellow cloud drifted silently. The gas attacked eyes, throats, and lungs. A new, terrible weapon had been unleashed. Soon both sides were using poison gas. Mustard gas was the worst, a silent, invisible killer. The gas mask became essential. The constant threat of gas attacks was psychological torture. The war reached a new level of scientific barbarity. Gas added misery to the trenches. Generals needed something to cross no man's land and shrug off machine gun fire. They needed a mechanical monster, a land ship. What they came up with was, quite possibly, the most agricultural-looking weapon of war ever invented. A big, clanking metal box on tracks. The first tanks rumbled into action at the Battle of the Somme in September 1916. They were slow, unreliable, and prone to breaking down. But for the German soldiers who saw them crawling over the shell craters, it was a terrifying sight. They were beasts of steel, impervious to bullets. By 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, the British unleashed nearly 400 tanks in a surprise mass attack. Still, the tank had proven its worth. It was the key to unlocking the trench deadlock. While soldiers were stuck in the mud, a new battlefield opened above, the sky. Early planes were flimsy, used for reconnaissance. Soon, pilots took pistols and rifles into the air. Then pilots like Roland Garros bolted machine guns to their planes. The fighter plane was born, leading to German air dominance. The sky became a deadly arena. Young pilots became heroes, the knights of the air. Giant bombers attacked cities far behind the front lines. The aeroplane had changed warfare forever, making the world smaller and more dangerous. World War I wasn't just fought on the front lines. It transformed life at home. With men gone, women stepped into roles they'd never held before. Bus conductors, police officers, farm workers, and, most crucially, factory laborers. Munitionettes risked their lives making weapons, some suffering TNT poisoning that turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. Women also served as nurses near the front, drove ambulances, and joined auxiliary forces. Their work was vital. Without them, the war effort would have collapsed. The war shattered old social barriers and gave women new confidence and independence. Their contribution made it impossible to deny them a voice in public life. In Britain, women over 30 gained the right to vote just after the war. Out of tragedy, a more equal society began to emerge. The home front was forever changed by the women who waited and the women who worked. When war broke out, Australia, a young nation, was far from the conflict, but didn't hesitate to join. Prime Minister Andrew Fisher pledged support for Britain to our last man and our last shilling. Patriotism swept the country. Thousands volunteered for the Australian Imperial Force, eager to prove themselves. These volunteers were proud, independent, and ready for adventure. Training in Egypt, they were rowdy but learned fast. They expected to fight in France, but British command had other plans. Their first battle would be on the shores of Gallipoli, not the fields of Europe. The journey from the outback to the trenches was just beginning. Australia's identity would be forged far from home. The real test was yet to come. Churchill's plan to knock the Ottomans out of the war was daring and disastrous. The Anzacs landed at Gallipoli on April 25, 1915, under heavy fire, on the wrong beach facing steep cliffs. Despite chaos and carnage, they dug in and held their ground. 8 months of brutal stalemate followed, snipers, disease, and relentless attacks. The Anzacs fought fiercely at places like Lone Pine and the Neck, earning respect for their courage and humor. The campaign ended in evacuation, brilliantly executed, but the mission was a failure. For Australia, Gallipoli became a defining moment. The Anzac legend was born in blood and sacrifice. Gallipoli was a disaster militarily, but it shaped a nation's spirit. Its legacy endures. After Gallipoli, the AIF split. Some fought as legendary cavalry in the deserts of Sinai and Palestine. The light horses' charge at Beersheba was a rare, stunning victory. Most Anzacs, though, were sent to the Western Front in France. There they faced industrialized slaughter, endless mud, gas, and artillery. The Australians gained a reputation as elite shock troops, thrown into the toughest battles. At Pozières, they suffered 23,000 casualties in 6 weeks for a tiny patch of ground. The war hardened them. Adventurers became grim veterans. The fields of France and Belgium became their final resting place. The Anzacs' journey led from desert sands to the muddy hell of Europe. Their sacrifice was immense. The Diggers played a crucial role in the war's final year, halting German advances and leading the Allied push to victory. But the cost was staggering. From a population under 5,417,000 enlisted, 62,000 died, 156,000 wounded. Nearly every Australian family was touched by loss. Survivors returned changed, many physically and mentally scarred, struggling to fit back into a changed society. The war's shadow lingered for generations. The Anzac legend was forged in defeat and sacrifice, not just victory. It's a story of courage, mateship, and the terrible cost of war. For Australia, the Great War was a coming of age, at a price almost too high to bear. The legacy is pride, pain, and a nation forever changed. The true cost of war is measured in lives and in memory. And so, it finally ended. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns on the Western Front fell silent, just a deafening, eerie silence. For the soldiers in the trenches, the war that had consumed their entire world was actually over. They had survived. It was a world broken, scarred, and utterly transformed. Great empires were all gone, crumbled into dust and revolution. A conservative estimate puts the number of dead at around 20 million. The victors gathered in Paris to hammer out a peace treaty. The resulting Treaty of Versailles was a messy compromise that blamed Germany for everything. In punishing Germany so harshly, the peacemakers sowed the seeds of an even greater conflict. The Great War was over, but its long, dark shadow would stretch for decades. So, was it worth it? All that death and destruction? It's hard to say yes. The war that was meant to be a glorious adventure turned into a senseless industrial meat grinder. It solved nothing. They called it the war to end all wars. What a joke. All the Great War did was provide a 20-year ceasefire. So why do we still remember it? We remember because of the scale of the sacrifice. Remembering the First World War is not about glorifying conflict. It's about remembering the cost of failure. It shows us that war is not a glorious adventure, it is a human tragedy. We can only hope we might get a little bit better at avoiding making the same mistakes again.